Uh, Hello, this is Subhash Gatade, associated with New Socialist Initiative. I welcome you all to this special lecture in the Democracy Dialogue series. Professor Zoha Hasan, Professor Emerita JNU, is our special guest this evening, and she will be talking on how did UP decide identities, interests, and politics. Many of us, you might have been witness to the last month's lecture, the Democracy Dialogue series itself, where Professor Zoha Hasan talked about challenges to India's democracy. I thank her for sparing time for us. She has many books to her credit, and she has written extensively on UP and other gender minorities in India. And her more recent publications, I can just list a few of them: Forging Identities, Gender, Communities and the State in India, Agitation to Legislation, Congress After Indira, Politics and of Inclusion, and a collection of essays titled Democracy and the Crisis of Inequality. Before I request Professor Zoha Hasan to initiate her talk, I would like to introduce our senior comrade, Dr. Ravi Sinha. He will be making initial comments. And I also like to introduce Comrade Bhargav, a senior member of NSI Executive. He will be handling the question and answer session. Friends, please welcome Professor Zoha Hasan. Zoha ji.
Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, Subhash, you got us confused, you know. Did you ask me to make initial comment?
No. After a speech, sorry. It's confusing. Okay. After a speech, please, Zoha ji, please, aap shuru kijiyega.
You go ahead. Yeah,
please, Zoha ji.
Am I supposed to start?
Yeah, should start. Please.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you. I'd like to thank the New Socialist Initiative, and especially Dr. Subhash Gatade for the invitation to give this special lecture. It is indeed a privilege to speak again under the auspices of this important initiative, the Democracy Dialogue. So thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss what is clearly an interesting and important subject, which is the UP elections. Now, the Uttar Pradesh Assembly elections of 2022 were the most important assembly election in living memory. It has set the stage for the next general election in 2024, with the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, and its allies winning a 2/3 majority in this crucial state. The UP election was significant because this state had given a massive mandate to the BJP in the 2014 parliamentary elections, in the 2017 assembly elections, and in the 2019 Lok Sabha election. The 2022 election, the momentous outcome in this election, is the subject of considerable debate among analysts and indeed the public at large. There was a premise this time, particularly in UP. One second. Okay. There was a premise this time, particularly in UP, that communal polarization wasn't working and acute economic discontent could trigger electoral change. However, the large-scale discontent over many economic issues did not translate into a decision to vote out the government. Many analysts have attributed the BJP's re-election to welfare measures and free rations to the poor during the lockdown. The focus of this debate here is between those who stress economic factors versus political and cultural factors. Most indications point to the indirect or contextual effects of the former, the more direct influence of the latter, and a strong interaction between these two, that is, the indirect and direct factors. Now, to begin with, then, let's come to the heart of the matter. And the heart of the matter is that UP is the heartland state of the majoritarian project. It's home to the three holy Hindu sites, which in many ways have functioned as the nerve center of Hindu majoritarian politics. The emblematic significance of Ayodhya, Banaras, and Mathura as symbols of Hindu unity cannot be overstated. None of the other states, even in North India, quite have this cultural and political cachet. It was in UP that the BJP formed the government after the Ayodhya movement. It was here for the first time that the BJP experimented with the politics of social engineering. Both elements have been critical to its success. The appointment of Yogi Adityanath as the chief minister in 2017 was a defining moment for this project. His appointment was indicative of the plans to amplify the majoritarian agenda. Under his leadership, UP has established what I would call a communal authoritarian model. And this model brooks no dissent, no disagreement, and no protest. This was demonstrated by the regime's handling of the protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act, which had provoked widespread protests across the country, but a very, very widespread protest in UP in particular. The state government responded very harshly, and this included seizing property of protesters, a penalty that was later halted by the Supreme Court. The violent police action in UP resulted in the death of at least 23 people, all of them Muslim. Now, the UP model that I just mentioned, that is the communal authoritarian model, works through two processes: the consolidation of Hindu dominance through authoritarian means, and the constant demonizing or demonization of the other, defined in terms of religion, and constantly reminding people of a threat from an enemy within. Now, what were the big issues then against this background in this election? The BJP victory is quite remarkable. Why is this so? Because it happened despite the state government's inept handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, and by the fact that it has very little to show by way of economic development in terms of growth and jobs, most importantly. Instead, the last 5 years witnessed a vigorous implementation of the majoritarian agenda. Headway has been made on the construction of the Grand Temple in Ayodhya, exactly where the Babri Masjid once stood. What is more important to note is that the Ram Temple, or the construction of the Ram Temple, is very much a state project. The government has enacted punitive laws to discourage interfaith marriages. The crackdown on cow slaughter that seems to target Muslims and has affected the meat trade, which is an important source of livelihood for large numbers of Muslims in that state. The names of cities and towns that had Muslim names have been replaced with Hindu ones. Textbooks have been revised, and so on and so forth. Now, in the economic sphere, the chief minister claims that UP has jump-started economic growth and created jobs aplenty. Yet when fact-checked, many of these claims, despite huge advertisements in newspapers, don't hold up. The state records one of the lowest growths in India, lowest growth rates in India. On most development indicators, the state ranks very poorly. It is economically backward and socially conservative. Even a cursory examination of the actual conditions of people would show no significant improvement in their social and economic condition or the quality of public life or health or education sectors and in employment opportunities. So a slew of issues, mostly economic ones, were in the forefront of popular concern, most notably high levels of joblessness, which is a countrywide phenomenon. But the situation was worse in UP. The severe unemployment crisis in UP was reflected in anecdotal reports from the ground captured in the election coverage. Massive protests by youth broke out in Bihar and in parts of eastern UP in January this year over alleged discrepancies in the Railway Recruitment Board non-technical popular category examination, in which over 700,000 candidates were shortlisted for just 35,000 posts. Now, what is also very significant is that none of this seemed to have had an impact, but equally significantly, COVID and farmers' movement did not have any major impact. This was the first election anywhere after the devastating second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. The chief minister had faced criticism over his government's handling of the pandemic, which had a large and unreported, or underreported, I should say, underreported death rate, with health workers reporting a complete collapse in the public health system and shortages of oxygen and hospital beds and people running from hospital to hospital. For weeks, bodies floated down the Ganga. But the disastrous impact of the pandemic was blamed significantly on district level officials and not on the state or the central government. Likewise, there was considerable discontent and opposition to agricultural reforms and the 3 farm laws that would favor big agri business at the expense of smaller farmers. This was also a big concern, which was brought into focus by the year-long farmers' movement that ended with the government being forced to withdraw the 3 farm laws. Now, farmers in Western UP, even though this movement was by no means concentrated in UP, but farmers in Western parts of UP were also mobilized against these laws and did participate quite extensively in this movement. However, this movement made virtually no impact on voting except in some pockets of UP. So the point then, which is really so surprising, is that the effect of both the farmers' protest and the pandemic was insignificant, if not non-existent. Even though the economic situation was against the background of these 3 developments that I've just mentioned: unemployment, COVID, and the farmers' movement. So the economic situation was tailor-made for major reversals for the BJP, but it romped home with 255 seats of the 403 seats in the state legislature, a margin that exceeded even its own expectations, not to speak of its critics. Now, the BJP's victory, its 4th since 2014, has sparked a major debate about the relationship between economic discontent and voter choices. What is the relationship between the two, if any? The UP election seems to suggest that the relationship is a rather thin one. The materialist understanding led many commentators, including myself, to argue that economic discontent would trigger an electoral change in UP. But alas, this did not happen. What explains this? I would argue that one of the reasons is communal polarization. And I say this even though I'm quite aware that there is a fair body of commentary since 10th of March, which argues that this is not the case. However, I would say or argue that the key to BJP's success is communal, the key to BJP's success is communal polarization, but that communal polarization is not something that happened just during the elections or can be attributed to the election campaign or to the speeches of BJP star campaigners. So my argument is this, that the key to BJP's success is far deeper than economics or welfare. It is based on two long-term projects. One is the cultural project and the other is the political project. The origins of the cultural project can be traced to Hindi politics, which played a key role in producing a Hindi-Hindu socio-cultural construct in the politics of North India and in the cultural development of UP society in particular. It was germane, I argue, to the emergence of the Hindu right in the late 20th century. Hindi expansion helped to construct the idea of the nation state as one that belongs exclusively to the Hindu community by foregrounding conquest and conflict and a politics of historical vendetta to invigorate Hindu nationalism. And of course, we are hearing so much about it in the last few years, in the last few months and weeks. From the mid-80s, these processes had moved from the popular discourse to the center of political deliberations. So from the start, this project of Hindi promotion had been taken over by Hindi propagandists with a clear political agenda tied to what Alok Rai argues in his book, in his wonderful book, Hindi Nationalism, that it was tied to a culturally exclusive, socially divisive, and ultimately upper caste and anti-democratic politics which had produced it, quote closed. Hindi expansionism contributed to the formation of a revivalist strand in the politics of UP, which ultimately sparked off right-wing resurgence. This process was further facilitated, I argue, Alok Rai doesn't necessarily argue this, this process was further facilitated by the expulsion of Urdu from UP. It cannot be a mere coincidence that the elimination of Urdu has coincided with the emergence of a Hindu identity and the marginalization of the rich and composite cultural traditions of the Indo-Gangetic belt. The proliferation of the Hindi media, of course, since the days of the Ram Temple movement, reinforced these processes, reinforced this cultural politics even further. Since then, the Hindi media has been an aggressive ideological tool in the dissemination of Hindu nationalism, or what can broadly be called Hindu nationalism. On the other hand, the political project was embodied in the campaign for a Ram Mandir in Ayodhya, which kick-started the rise of Hindutva. The Ayodhya temple movement had its greatest impact in UP. And it is surprising that people don't take this into account in their analysis of the success of BJP. Hindu nationalists worked assiduously to consolidate the Hindu community in UP, which prepared the ground for the rise to power of the BJP. The systematic push for political power wouldn't have advanced as it has in the last 30 years, without the ground prepared by the Ayodhya movement, prompting an escalation of political mobilization along religious lines in state elections and state politics. Politically, it opened up the prospect of changing both the ideological discourse and institutional politics in favor of the majoritarian idea of India as a Hindu nation, both at the national and state level. Importantly, it laid the groundwork for a permanent communal majority in the Hindi heartland, which, given its overwhelming size, helped the Hindu right to establish a strong base to offset its weakness in other parts of the country, most notably in South India, with the exception of Karnataka, of course, and the eastern parts of the country. Today, Ayodhya is certainly not an election issue in the way in which it was 2 or 3 decades ago, but that is because it is now subsumed under nationalism. BJP's victory in this election, despite the severe economic crisis and the unemployment crisis facing the people, has to be seen in the light of these long-term efforts to build a permanent Hindu constituency in this keystone, crucial state. Secondly, communal politics was given a substantial push by the Chief Minister's statement in the beginning of the 2022 campaign that UP was facing an 80-20 election, denoting a clear reference to the state's 40 million Muslims who represent roughly 20% of the population. This template, the 80-20 template, framed the meta-narrative of the campaign, and this signaled the central role of communalism, further unifying the 80% Hindus while relegating the 20% to the margins, or if not to a second-class status. So the communal thrust of the campaign was not in the course of the electioneering was not in your face, but it was disguised through an excessive emphasis on law and order. The law and order platform echoed fears very deliberately about Muslim criminality, depicted through front page advertisements in newspapers with 2 images of a young man with a kafaya around his neck, symbolizing a terrorist, and the other without a kafaya, seeking pardon. And the caption was, "Now we have established law and order in the state." Secondly, as part of this law and order platform, the use of the bulldozer, which of course is now no more a UP weapon, it's become an all India weapon, the use of the bulldozer to demolish those seen opposing the ruling party and placing bulldozers outside election rallies was another unabashed signal of the same message. The law and order rhetoric was explicitly meant to divide citizens into 2 classes, those who are lawful by nature and those who are not. That is, those who are inherently lawless. This created a strong sense of community, which translated into a Hindu vote. Over the past 5 years, the Hindu vote has reinforced an exclusive majoritarian orientation of political structures in laws and in public policy. And in general, there is a sense that Muslims, after having enjoyed a political veto in the state, have been shown their place. This then brings me to this, as far my argument goes, is really the crux of the matter, but this brings me to the crux of the argument that others are making, who do not think that communal polarization played a part, and argue that welfarism was important. I also think that welfarism was certainly an important part, and clearly BJP's electoral victory in UP in particular has put the spotlight once again on the centrality of welfare schemes in its victory. Welfare schemes were clearly an important and visible part of the campaign, so much so that the term Labharti, BJP's term for beneficiaries, has entered the political lexicon as a category of political analysis. Polling data shows that these schemes were actively used by the ruling party to gain legitimacy and support those and the support of those who benefited from them. Under this model, welfare is not a political duty of the state, but rather an act of benevolence returned to political returns. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's repeated references to free rations during his campaign speeches did not go unnoticed, with his photograph printed on the ration bags, coupled with a sharp organizational focus on identifying beneficiaries and reaching out to them to remind them of what the government had done. This helped to amplify the message. From what we know so far, welfare schemes did influence voter choices because the most important aspect of these schemes is its emphasis on direct benefits, cash transfers, providing toilets, housing, and free rations since the pandemic. Arvind Subramaniam points out that this was subsidized public provisioning of private goods. This, he quotes, is a new form of welfarism where public goods such as health and basic education are not given the same priority as targeted distribution of private goods. Most importantly, these economic benefits were not provided as a matter of right to decent living, but as largesse by the state, as I just mentioned. By contrast, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme was instituted as an economic right, but this has been whittled down, while one-time provision of private goods has been given a top priority. Now, the point is that these are no doubt important, but the citizen cannot actively claim these benefits as rights. This is, as many have argued, and most notably Yamini Iyer in a recent article in the Hindustan Times has argued, that this is a remarkably neoliberal take on welfare, which a dimension that is ignored in the public discourse, which tends to view any kind of welfare provisioning as left wing. Now, this form of welfarism, stripped of and emptied of the language of rights, has undoubtedly promoted political mobilization for the right wing. While we must not disregard the significance of the economic relief provided to people through these schemes, especially free rations during the pandemic, and with very little prospect of gainful employment, it does not explain the success of BJP in UP in this election. Welfare schemes were simply not enough to offset the huge economic distress and unprecedented levels of unemployment. In the event, people voted for a combination of economic and non-economic reasons, economic and non-economic reasons, which is to say they voted for the overall political agenda of this government. Those who see the BJP's victory as primarily a vindication of its welfare policies ignore the compelling logic of communal politics, the history of communal politics in UP, and its contribution to the systematic construction of a Hindu vote in UP since the time of the Ayodhya movement, and the communal campaigns in the last 5 years, which were centered in UP. Their impact is reflected in this election. Now, the construction of the Hindu vote was so significant that it has also trumped caste-based politics of regional parties such as the Samajwadi Party and the Bahujan Samaj Party through a mobilization of upper caste and non-dominant backward and lower caste communities. So, along with economic discontent and joblessness and the historical significance of communal politics, This election has put a very big question mark on mandal politics, or at least the kind that is practiced by the Samajwadi Party and the BSP. Caste is indeed the central axis around which the Samajwadi Party and the Bahujan Samajwadi Party politics is organized. But reconfiguring of caste coalitions, which dominated Samajwadi Party strategy, clearly shows that there are limits to caste-driven politics, which cannot really solve the dilemmas of inequality, unemployment, or even representation, which is the central concern of these parties. Caste alliances, I would argue, merely displace religion with caste as a central organizing principle of politics, and the caste-oriented social justice plank was clearly superseded by the BJP, which co-opted non-dominant backward castes within the Hindu umbrella by giving greater representation to underrepresented groups and by emphasizing their Hindu identity under the capacious Hindu umbrella. This has paid rich dividends for the BJP, which has, to a great extent, diluted the mandal factor by accommodating caste grievances, as BJP had done in 2017 and clearly in 2022 also. In the final analysis, as I come to the conclusion, the BJP didn't win votes for what its leaders said during the campaign. It harvested support because of its communal campaigns over the past several decades, and especially in the last 5 years, leading to the manipulation of the Hindu-Muslim fault line. That was a common thread which reinforced the political mobilization of the ruling party. As a result, people are willing to overlook the economic failures of the government. Economic discontent was then cancelled out by the much greater cultural and ideological acceptance of the BJP as the champion and defender of Hindus. This is demonstrated, of course, by the results of this election. Now, BJP's dominance then, as I tried to argue, is based on a Hindu coalition. Is based on a Hindu coalition. Now, one could blame that the opposition, as I have also suggested, that Samajwadi Party's caste-driven politics has its limitations. So one could blame the opposition to some extent for this denouement. The Samajwadi Party entered the election very late and was hardly active during the past 5 years. Also, the BSP was inactive and had virtually gone into hibernation. The Congress made as much noise as it could, but it lacks the organization to translate this into votes, and so on. But above all, I think the absence of a continuous narrative damaged the opposition hugely. Both the Congress and the BSP were virtually non-existent. The Samajwadi Party was too weak to take on the BJP behemoth. By contrast, the BJP success was the result of decades of mobilization, which cannot be countered by just a few months of campaign and rallies before polls, but by being in the field continuously and raising ideological issues and not staying mute on them. Now, what are the implications of the UP mandate? I think the implications of the UP mandate is the active destruction of the rule of law by the rule of the bulldozer, criminalizing protests and speech, restricting human rights, and weakening constitutional democracy overall. The larger question is what happens to the party system when centrist or center-left parties become eviscerated or weakened, and these parties are no longer significant players. For example, in UP, we can clearly see that Congress and Bahujan Samaj Party, BSP, are insignificant. And for them to be insignificant in such a large state has huge implications and consequences for the party system. The fact that the Congress party is now employing the services of a political consultant to revive its fortunes, which most other parties have hired his services in the past, demonstrates both the crisis of the opposition and the Congress party in particular, which is the principal opposition party at the national level. Even if the tactical advice given by the political consultant ends up reviving the Congress somewhat, helping it to double its Lok Sabha numbers, this can only be temporary. The right-wing assault on democracy and the crisis of the party system cannot be reversed unless the neoliberal economic conjuncture that produces it is transcended. And most political parties, including the Congress, are not considering this aspect, despite the fact that the upsurge of right-wing populism is a global phenomenon. And most opposition parties are unwilling to put up a united front against it. For them, it is business as usual, unmindful of the threats to our democracy. But the question that arises from the UP experience is why opposition parties are not effective despite the economic crisis. This is really the central question that must concern us. Right-wing populism, neoliberalism, money power, and misuse of state machinery has undoubtedly weakened and undermined opposition parties. It has weakened the strength of many, many parties. And it's obvious that political parties haven't found a way of transcending these constraints to reacquire relevance. But the problem is not just about opposition parties and their failures. And we always zero in attacking opposition parties. And of course, they're not doing enough. But we should also be concerned about what is happening to voters, which is driving them to the party of the right, which is illiberal, intolerant, and anti-democratic. And yet people are sort of supporting this party in such huge numbers. So the causes of its rise, of course, have been the subject of discussion, but its continued attractiveness 8 years later, when it has not really been able to deliver on most of its promises, ought to be a matter of concern. That is to say, not just the causes of its rise, but its continued attractiveness to voters ought to be a matter of concern. Voters are clearly vulnerable to cultural appeals. Democracy and the party system has difficulty when cultural factors dominate, especially in the present conjuncture when parties have little to offer by way of jobs, for example. In these circumstances, right-wing parties double down on cultural factors, as we can see in the communal rampaging across India in the last few weeks, partly because economic policies are not working. Communalism increasingly serves a purpose: mass distraction, taking attention away from the issue of jobs and livelihood, while ostensibly giving a sense of power and meaning to the lives of those excluded from society's economic activities. I think if we were to just look at the social background of people who are taking part in these religious processions, I think would clearly indicate this, that they come from a certain class of people with a certain social background. And yet, opposition parties too are reluctant to jettison the culturalist argument. Now, finally, can UP's turn to the right be reversed? Undoubtedly, the Hindu right is well entrenched in UP. But in the shifting sands of UP politics, which has been witness to momentous changes in the last 100 years, this too can change, and I expect it will change. The wider issues thrown up in this election, the bulldozer approach to dissent, communal polarization, economic inequality, agrarian distress, joblessness, and public health will not go away and will continue to influence public discourse and voter choices in the longer run. Moreover, the wider currents of resistance in the country will impact UP as well. They may not have done so right now, but in the days, months, and years to come, I expect it will impact. A major source of hope then is the resistance from region-based and regional parties in the South and the East that see the unfolding of this project, the right-wing project, as an assault on what remains of federalism in India. There's resistance in the media, in the digital media, in the social media, and even to some extent in the mainstream media, and of course in universities. Despite the near total control of the big media by the government, the fact that there were two major mass movements in the course of 1 year, one against the Citizenship Amendment Act and the other against the farm laws, is reason for optimism, at least the optimism of will. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this exciting presentation, the analysis of the elections and the challenges which Indian democracy awaits at this juncture. I will request Comrade Ravi Sinha to make initial comments. Ravi.
Thank you, Subhash, and thank you, Zoya ji, so much. Thank you doubly for giving this special lecture soon after your wonderful lecture last month. And Subhash calls me each time before anybody else so that another man with white beard can give thanks to our speaker.
To a speaker with white hair, yes.
Yes, and we are really, it's such a wonderful for agreeing to give this lecture at such short notice. And we are, believe me, we are all eager to become your regular students. So we will call upon you very frequently.
I hope not.
When Subhash and Bhargav pick up the questions and comments from the chat box, let me just begin the discussion by, it is very difficult to what you have said. It is such succinct and such comprehensive analysis of what has must have gone on in UP. I wonder if you will have some thoughts or comments on then what should the progressive left of center forces have as a medium-term strategy. In the short run, I know it is very difficult to do something. It is easy to criticize opposition parties, and they could have perhaps done better if they jumped into the election campaign a little earlier than they did. But given the scope of crisis and the problem that you have just talked about, one expects, we are accustomed to thinking that we will speak the truth, we will speak against communalism, we will speak for real issues that affect life, that include the material economic factors, and yet they don't work. Given the Hindu-Muslim tectonic plate or Hindu-Muslim divide, given the fact that public cultural mind is such that cultural issues easily trump the material and economic issues. What should we do? I mean, I feel happy that there is a Congress leader who openly names RSS and Sangh Parivar and says that that is the disaster for India that has struck India. And the more he says that, more marginalized he gets. And the playing field gets tilted more and more against him. So ideologically, he sounds clearer than most of old school Congress leaders. And yet he is ridiculed not by the BJP, but also part of Congress. So what is obviously right thing to say that we should be secular, we should be progressive, we should have fight for material interests of the people at large. Those things don't matter. And the leader who gathers some courage to talk about those issues easily gets marginalized. So I am kind of repeating partly what you have said, but I wonder if you have some further thought about future medium-term strategy for 5 or 10 years for, I am not talking of left progressive forces alone. I am talking of left of center mainstream political forces too. So I will stop at that and see if you have comments to make on that.
I must confess, I don't really have anything very original to say on this. Whatever I say is something that we've all thought about and talked about. So what should the progressive forces be doing in the short run and in the long run? I think at least as far as UP is concerned, and I hope there are people from UP who will comment on this. One is, I think, the need to strengthen civil society in UP, because civil society in UP has been hugely penetrated and dominated by sort of religious organizations, by religious groups, and so on and so forth. So I think there needs to be a kind of a non-religious civil society, number one. Number two, I think there should be more NGOs in UP. UP is one state where the state dominates and the non-governmental sphere is quite weak. This then brings me to the third point, which is that obviously there's need for greater public action in UP, greater public action with a focus on livelihood issues, on human and social development, which has been neglected in UP, and that is part of the reason why sort of religious politics and cultural politics is found to be more attractive. And then I imagine there has to be more direct anti-communal campaigns. Now, it is somewhat unfashionable to talk about composite culture and so on, but I think some of the spirit of that culture and coexistence and living together, I think that needs to be revived through anti-communal campaigns, which UP has not witnessed. Because after all, what the opposition parties are somewhat disadvantageously placed, precisely because they're faced with control of the media by the government, money, power, and the RSS. So this combination of media, money, power, and RSS is such a powerful, is so powerful that it is not easy. It is not easy to compete against that. But nonetheless, I do think that greater public action, continuous public action, and not just reactive public action, which is to say that something happens wherever, now or Hathras or Lakhimpur Kheri, and opposition parties are activated. I think there has to be continuous public mobilization and public action, which one side is doing but the other side is not doing.
We have with us Professor Ramesh Dixit, is an old activist and friend. Rameshji, your comment. Please unmute yourself. आप अनम्यूट कर लीजिए अपने आप. हाँ प्लीज. हाँ,
मुझे इतना जोया का भाषण बहुत अच्छा लगा. मैं हिंदी में बोल रहा हूँ, मुझे यूपी का रहने वाला हूँ, मुझे हिंदी आती है, अंग्रेजी आती नहीं है, इसलिए बहुत ही अच्छा उन्होंने जितनी वजह बताई.
आप अनम्यूट कर लीजिए. आप फिर म्यूट हो गए रमेश जी.
मुझे दो बातें कहनी है.
हाँ प्लीज.
नंबर एक, जो आखिरी बातें जो कही जोया जी ने, उससे मुझे डर लगता है. उन्होंने ये कहा है कि जनता के बारे में लोगों ने कैसे तय कर दिया. मुझे लगता है कि अगर हम किसी डेमोक्रेटिक फ्रेमवर्क में अल्टीमेटली अपनी गलतियों के लिए जनता को ब्लेम करने लग जाएंगे तो कोई रास्ता निकलने वाला नहीं है. लोग कम्युनल नहीं हुए हैं. जो अपने को सेकुलर कहते हैं, दे डिड नॉट ट्राई टू रीच आउट टू पीपल. जनता तक पहुंचने की कोई कोशिश क्या किसी नॉन बीजेपी नेता ने की थी? ये सवाल पूछा जाना चाहिए. हमें अपने गिरेबान में झांकना चाहिए कि क्या हमने कोई कोशिश की थी. वहां पर हुआ क्या है कि जिस बीजेपी लगातार जनता के तमाम सेक्शन तक पहुंचने की कोशिश कर रही है, पहले हम उसे अर्बन पार्टी कहते थे, वो गांव में पहुंच गई तो गांव गांव तक पहुंच गए वो. और जो शहरी मिडिल ऑफ कहना चाहिए सेंट्रिस्ट पार्टीज, लेफ्टिस्ट पार्टीज, लिबरल्स, ये सारे के सारे लोग एक काम सीख गए. अच्छा काम क्या है, पिछले 5 साल में मोमबत्तियां हाथ में गिरी और चल दिए. 5 लोग खड़े होके मोमबत्ती जलानी शुरू कर दी. हर मुद्दा का एक ही इलाज था, मोमबत्ती जला देना. तो सवाल ये है कि क्या डेमोक्रेसी में जनता नाम की जो शख्सियत है, एब्स्ट्रैक्शन है, पीपुल, उसकी कोई हैसियत है कि नहीं? इस इलेक्शन में साफ हो गया कि अखिलेश यादव वो इसलिए इतनी सीटें पा सके क्योंकि उन्होंने जमीन के स्तर पर काफी कोशिश की थी लोगों को जोड़ने की, कास्ट के स्तर पर. और सुभाष जी, आप बेहतर जानते हैं कि बाबा साहब अम्बेडकर ने एक बात जो कही थी कि हिंदुइज्म तो कुल मिलाकर तमाम जातियों का एक जमावड़ा है और हिंदू तभी एक होते हैं जब उन्हें मुसलमानों के खिलाफ कुछ कहना होता है. तो यहाँ पर जो हिंदुओं की यूनिटी हुई है यूपी में, वो यूनिटी दरअसल केवल और केवल माइनॉरिटी के खिलाफ हुई है. और हमें इस बात को मानना चाहिए कि हमारी गलती, जो सेकुलर क्लास है, उसकी गलती ये है कि उन्होंने जनता के किसी भी सेक्शन को एडजस्ट करने की कोई कोशिश की ही नहीं. ये फेलियर है एंग्लिसाइज्ड अर्बन सेकुलर मिडिल क्लास की, जो समझता है हमें सब पता है मगर उन्हें जनता से परेशानी होती है. संक्षेप में आखिरी बात यह है कि दरअसल ये चुनाव तो निश्चित तौर पर आएगी विद जोया कि ये खुला 80 बनाम 20 का चुनाव ये भाजपा ने जीता है, सांप्रदायिक ध्रुवीकरण करने के हिसाब से जीता है. इसमें ये जो वेलफेयरिज्म की बात की जाती है, लाभार्थी की बात की जाती है, वो केवल आंखें पोंछना है, उसका कोई मतलब नहीं है. ये बिल्कुल आई वॉश है, इसको हमें नहीं बाय करना चाहिए. रास्ता केवल ये है कि 2 मौके बताता हूं मैं आपको. 1993 में फिर समाजवादी पार्टी एंड बीएसपी केम टुगेदर, दे वन द इलेक्शंस. 2002 में फिर समाजवादी पार्टी एंड बहुजन समाज पार्टी केम टुगेदर, दे वन द इलेक्शंस. रास्ता एक ही है कि सामाजिक न्याय की शक्तियां ही हिंदू सांप्रदायिकता का मुकाबला कर सकती हैं. सामाजिक न्याय का प्लैंक ही एक ऐसा प्लैंक है जिस पर खड़े होकर एक कोशिश की जाती है भाजपा को हराने की. और मुझे अफसोस इस बात का है, जो सबसे बड़ी पार्टी राष्ट्रीय स्तर पर है कांग्रेस पार्टी के पास सामाजिक न्याय के बारे में कोई विजन नहीं है. और जिन लोगों के पास विजन है, उनके चेहरे इतने रूखे सूखे हैं, वो बेचारे हिंदी वाले हैं, अंग्रेजी वाले हैं नहीं. अखिलेश यादव जो हैं वो थोड़ा सा कहना चाहिए उतने एंग्लिसाइज नहीं है जितने राहुल बाबा हैं. तो सवाल है कि आप थोड़ा सा तेजस्वी यादवों को, अखिलेश यादवों को थोड़ा सा प्यार करना सीख लीजिए तो शायद हिंदुत्व से लड़ना आसान हो जाए। बहुत शुक्रिया।
जोया जी, would like to comment? आप म्यूट हैं, यू आर म्यूट।
जस्ट सिर्फ एक पॉइंट जो रमेश ने बाद में कहा, और वो ये है कि जो कांग्रेस पार्टी का ओबीसी की तरफ जो पूरा रवैया रहा है, उसके तहत बहुत लिमिटेशंस हैं, और वो शुरू से अभी तक उनको उनमें जो एक एम्बिग्विटी है बैकवर्ड कास्ट के लिए, ये बिल्कुल सही कह रहे हैं। हालांकि 27% रिजर्वेशन उन्होंने किए हायर एजुकेशन में, मगर उससे पहले जो उन्होंने, क्योंकि मंडल को एक तरह से अपोज किया, वो उसकी वजह से पूरी जो पॉलिटिक्स पे उसका जो असर हुआ और जो डिविजन्स उसकी वजह से पैदा हुए, वो प्रॉब्लमैटिक, और उसका फायदा बहरहाल बीजेपी ने उठाया। मगर अब इस वक्त ये बहस इस पे करने से कोई फायदा नहीं है कि किस हद तक कास्ट पार्टीज, या जिनको आप सोशल जस्टिस पार्टीज कहें, वो ही बीजेपी का मुकाबला कर सकती। हमको तो ऐसा नहीं लग रहा है कि वो मुकाबला कर सकती हैं, बल्कि अब आप बीएसपी को देखिए, जो बीएसपी का हाल हो रहा है, उससे तो नहीं लग रहा है कि ये पार्टीज कर सकती हैं। और
2% वोट पे कांग्रेस पार्टी क्या कर लेगी यूपी में?
देखिए, अब उस बहस में पढ़ना के
बहस नहीं, मैं गुजारिश ये करना चाहता हूँ कि जिन पार्टियों ने जिस रफ्तार से अपने एनजीओइजेशन की प्रोसेस तेज कर दी, लेफ्ट पार्टियां एनजीओ बन के रह गई, सारी लेफ्ट पार्टियां। उत्तर प्रदेश में कम से कम वो पार्टियां कम है, एनजीओ ज्यादा है। एनजीओ की पहुंच आम जनता तक नहीं होती है, पॉलिटिकल पार्टीज की पहुंच आम जनता तक होती है। तो सवाल है कि एनजीओइजेशन से बचने की कोशिश करना, और सोशल जस्टिस की पार्टियां जमीन से जुड़ी हुई होती हैं, जिनके जमीन पर पैर होते हैं, उनके एनजीओ वालों के पैर जमीन पर नहीं होते हैं, और नया एंग्लिसाइज मिडिल क्लास के जमीन पे पैर होते हैं। तो सवाल है, जिसके जमीन पर पैर होंगे वो भाजपा से लड़ पाएगा। केवल हवा में रहते हुए, दिल्ली में रहते हुए बड़ी बड़ी बहसें करने से क्या होगा? हम यहाँ पहुंच गए हैं, इतना ज्ञान दे दिया हमको, तमाम लोगों ने इतना ज्ञान दे दिया कि पूरा देश सौंप दिया भाजपा के हाथ में। तो ज्ञान कम पर जनता के साथ संवाद ज्यादा। कोई डायलॉग लेफ्ट लिबरल्स का आम जनता के साथ नहीं है, बिल्कुल साफ है। तो थोड़ा बहुत है भी, वो सामाजिक न्याय की ताकतों का ही डायलॉग जनता के साथ में है, एंड ओनली दे कैन फाइट अगेंस्ट बीजेपी।
चलिए, ऑल द वेरी बेस्ट टू देम।
Margo, can you take up the questions in the chat box?
आप अच्छा देखते हैं, आप पढ़ दीजिए।
Yes, yeah, I will just. Good evening, madam. There are a few questions in the chat box. I'll just read them out for you.
I can read one of them. Would you like to?
There is a question from a person whose name is not identified. Do you think the celebration of regional politics and state-based parties created a space for this cultural dimension that the BJP is now exploiting? That's a question he's posing. This cultural regional parties, state-level parties, have they created this cultural dimension to the politics, and which now BJP is exploiting? That is the query he has in mind.
Okay.
And should I read another question too?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, there is a question by Khan Yazdani. What will be the alternative for the opposition parties that proved insignificant in UP elections to achieve a significant result in 2024 Lok Sabha elections to protect democratic and secular tenets of our constitution? So these are the two questions we got.
Okay. All right. On the second one, I think we've already dealt with that, which is to say, what is the alternative and how they will perform in 2024 Lok Sabha elections. The regional parties are unlikely. I mean, that is in UP. I'm talking about UP. they are unlikely to do any better. In fact, if anything, they might do worse in the Lok Sabha election. On whether regional parties and have created the conditions for the growth of BJP, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that. And also, there's no one type of regional parties. There are state-based parties, then there are regional parties, which actually are not just region-based, but are regionalist in their orientation. So I would not say, for example, the regional parties are very strong in Tamil Nadu and so on. And Tamil Nadu, BJP has not been able to make any major headway. In fact, barring Karnataka, in the five southern states, it has not made a big headway. So in fact, regional parties are a buffer against the BJP and are a stronger buffer, if I may say so, against the BJP than the caste-based parties. No doubt the caste-based parties were able to counter the BJP at one point, but not so now. Whereas the DMK, for example, continues to be a very strong opposition to the BJP.
A young scholar Divya is with us. She wants to ask some question. I will request her to be very brief. Divya, please.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Am I audible, sir?
Yeah.
Okay, sir. Hi, sir. Thank you for this opportunity. Professor Zoya, I'm Divya. I'm a student at the Department of Political Science, Delhi University. And I'm very deeply intrigued by the way you brought out the politicization of the culture by the BJP in Uttar Pradesh, and how right-wing populism is finding a huge electoral appeal in UP especially. I have a query with relation to your observation on how welfareism has been used by BJP in UP particularly. You said that how BJP uses its welfare policy as kind of a benevolent giver and not in the language of rights. And I feel, ma'am, I think this has been the political narrative in other welfare-centric states in other parts of India as well, where delivery of welfare schemes is seen as party-driven or party-given or driven by personalistic cults of the political leaders. So how is then BJP has been particularly made to use this narrative of welfareism in UP particularly? How do you find it distinctive in terms of UP especially? Thank you. That's the question.
I think you make an important, which is to say that the idea of a benevolent state and attributing welfare schemes to a leader is not unique to BJP, and I think you have in mind Jayalalitha and Tamil Nadu and so on. But perhaps while it is true of Tamil Nadu, but if you were to compare at the national level, let us say the way in which the NDA has gone about it, and let us say the UPA, which introduced a whole slew of welfare schemes and rights-based legislative measures, but did not really, but it was not necessarily so directly identified with the leader. Now, of course, that may have to do with the political system that the UP had created and the dual centers of power between the Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, and the Congress President and the chairperson of the UP Alliance, Mrs. Sonia Gandhi. So there were obviously some issues there which might also have been in the way of being able to take advantage. But I do think that I think the extent to which the ruling party has gone in taking advantage of this and in sort of projecting this as a largesse of the government in power, I think is somewhat much stronger now than before, with the exception of perhaps Tamil Nadu and with the exception of Jayalalitha.
Thank you. Thank you.
But
Anand-
you're right, there is a point that this, we can't just say that BJP alone is doing this.
Anand Phadke, Dr. Anand Phadke has raised his hand. I think, Anand, please unmute yourself.
Yes, my excellent presentation by Professor Zoha, and I've added some small minor supplementary points in my notes, comments. So I don't want to repeat that. My question to her is that, as many people have said, and probably also earlier in your earlier communication, you have said that actually BJP is a combination of brazen crony capitalism run amok, as well as a communal fascism. And but if you also, that's absolutely true. But you look at Orissa, Bihar, southern states, leave aside northeastern states, they have so far not been able to make a big dent. And without a qualitatively different political economy, I think the same thing that Congress has also unleashed of some kind of not so brazen, but basically corporate capitalism, etc., etc. The same economic program with some little variation here and there of populist welfareism, etc., etc. These parties continue to win elections despite BJP's 24/7 this election machine, as well as the huge donation that they have. So what explains this? My question is, what explains this, number one? And number two, what are the prospects of 2024 elections? I know this is not the topic for today, but we all are more concerned about this 22 results, primarily also because do they show any indications toward 2024? So, and thirdly, the left forces. We have been forced in a way to reduce ourselves to supporting the, in a sense, obsolete Nehruvian welfareism, which played a very important role and which left also played an important role. But the same kind of Nehruvian welfareism with all its limitations of bureaucratic capitalism or state capitalism, can it actually inform the left also? Or the left has to go beyond what one can say that it's an once progressive but now obsolete Nehruvian state capitalism?
Well, you've raised so many issues and all of them extremely important. And in a way, you even answered some of what you've said. But I think one of the great mysteries is what you have hinted at, which is that, you know, in a period of economic crisis of neoliberalism, or the crisis of neoliberalism more generally, one would expect the left to be able to take advantage and for the left to be able to gain popular support. But that hasn't happened. And that is something that is something that we need to understand. And I must say, I can't immediately answer that, but that is really very, very, very important. And as to your point about no, while I don't know if I would use the word obsolete, I don't think welfareism of the earlier variety is obsolete. But I take your point that obviously, I mean, political parties have to be innovative, and the left has certainly not been very innovative. Even the centrist parties or center-left parties have not been very innovative, although I would say that the UPA, when it introduced, the Congress-led UPA government, when it introduced the rights-based legislation, that was innovative. That was an attempt at an Indian version of social democracy. No doubt limited, no doubt you could say that it was not enough, but nonetheless, it was there. So there was some innovation there. You could say that the Kerala model of development was innovative at one point in time, but obviously one should go beyond that. But while we can say that, so I would not say that the UPA model of rights-based legislation is obsolete. So I do not think that the rights-based legislations were based on Nehruvian welfareism. It was going beyond that. And that is why it was significant. And it did break new ground. it did break new ground, but for a variety of reasons, the UPA corruption being very important and differences within the Congress party, the dual, this kind of diarchy, all of that. I mean, there's so many reasons why the UPA collapsed, not to speak of the huge anti-corruption campaign that was mounted by the India Against Corruption, backed by the RSS, that delegitimized the UPA. So I think UPA was an attempt at doing at innovation. There was some of that. So obsolete it was not. But what is it then that you would say if all of that is obsolete? Then what is it that opposition parties can do? I mean, while we can all say that that all that is obsolete, is not working, it's status quoist and so on, but what is it that opposition parties can do which is new and different and would attract voter support? I must confess, I don't really have any easy answer, but I'm certainly looking for some, and if you have any, it would be wonderful to hear that.
No, I'm sorry. Welfarism was
Joya.
absolutely not. Just one mistake. Welfarism is not at all obsolete. It was a wrong expression on my part. I was trying that the model of state capitalism, which is highly bureaucratic, is obsolete. Whereas welfarism, actually, we should be proud that the left pushed welfarism up to a certain extent in UP and a rights-based approach. I use the term obsolete for the kind of Nehruvian state capitalism model, which was progressive but highly bureaucratic, and that led to degeneration. Welfarism is never obsolete.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, my expression.
No, it's fine. That's fine.
Yeah, Professor Joya, there are three questions. They're a little related and also point out three different dimensions. I will read them together. One is posed by Sunil Gatade. He's asking, 1 minute, I'm sorry. He's asking, in spite of so much Hindutva resurgence in UP, the Chief Minister of Bihar, who shares power with BJP, creates flutter by attending iftar of the leader of the opposition. Does it show the allies of the BJP are also getting nervous now in other parts? That's a question posed by Sunil Gatade. And there is another question from Usman. I read out. Thank you, Professor Hasan, for the comprehensive picture you drew for us. Two questions. One, while I agree with acknowledging the role of communal mobilization of past decades, especially in making Hindutva ideas part of the common sense, there is something jarring as an explanation to draw a straight line between the Ayodhya plus mobilization and the BJP's victories in 2017, 19, and 22, given the BJP was not even second in the electoral contexts between 2002 to 2017. Do you see SP-BSP style Mandal politics forming a small hurdle for Hindutva, or did something else qualitative also change in the 2012 and 14 period? Second, the administration usually is often supportive of the incumbent, but there are reports of very, very active role, especially of police, in ensuring the BJP's victory. Would you like to comment on this ideological and organizational infiltration of administrative and policing agencies by the Hindutva movement as being a qualitatively new factor in explaining their overall hegemony? This is a question by Usman, and another friend has asked Ram Mohan. He is expressing a kind of a doubt that some agencies like CSDS who registered that there are at least 8% of Muslim votes going to BJP in some constituencies in small packets. At least 15% of votes, Muslim votes are going to BJP, and how do we see this trend?
How much going to BJP? 8%.
In some 8% votes going to BJP, and in some certain pockets even 15% of votes are going to BJP. And how do we see this?
Okay. I mean, Nitish Kumar attending iftar, what can one say? He's keeping his options open. That doesn't necessarily mean that that BJP is facing difficulties. In fact, I think he's fearing that BJP might well demand the chief ministership once he completes whatever half his term. Whether one can draw a straight line between Ayodhya and the 2022 results, no, you're right, one cannot. It's very difficult to do that. But I think one is talking about the context. And the context is the historical context, the political context, and surely that plays a part. If it is not all of this, then how are we to understand? Because on the face of it, the BJP campaign was not a very communal campaign, barring the 80-20 template. Then it's very difficult to explain the major shifts in UP politics unless we take into account, unless we historicize the verdict. Mandal, of course, has played a very important part in UP, and it has played an important part. It was an important counterweight to Mandal, and Mandal has done its bit in keeping the BJP in check in UP. But it may have outlived its utility. That is my point. Now, it's a point that you may not and others may not agree with. But I do think that it seems to have outlived its unity. The point about penetration of Hindutva into the state and state agencies, of course, that is very, very important. And yes, you're right in suggesting that this is a new development, especially in UP, the role of the police, which was even in earlier periods was not unbiased. But now the question is not a bias; it is very much an instrument of the agenda of the state, and they are really promoting the agenda of the state. Muslim vote, I don't really, I must confess, I haven't really looked into this whole issue of Muslim vote, and there may, I mean, it's possible that 8 to 10% people might well have voted, would have voted. So I mean, it's not as though every single Muslim is going to vote against the BJP. If we look at the past few elections, anything between 6 to 10% Muslims have voted for the BJP, which is okay. I don't know how significant that is, because the fact that some Muslims vote for the BJP does not in any way take away from the anti-Muslim politics of the BJP. If that is the point that you were hinting at, then I mean, even if 20% people, Muslims vote, that still doesn't in any way dilute the anti-Muslim thrust of BJP's politics, because BJP's politics is not necessarily pro-Hindu as much as it is anti-Muslim. That's what it is, and that is what gives a sharp edge to their politics.
मुशर्रफ अली हैं हमारे साथ जुड़े हैं। मुशर्रफ अली, आप सवाल पूछिएगा, अनम्यूट करके कर लीजिए अपने आप।
असल में जोया हसन साहिबा ने जो बात रखी है, तो इसके अंदर जो है मेरी आवाज आ रही है ना अब तक?
हाँ, आ रही है।
बहुत अच्छी आवाज आ रही है।
तो मेरे जहन में ये है जो सवाल कि बीजेपी के इस स्थिति तक पहुंचने का कारण क्या है, जो इतनी पावरफुल यहाँ तक आ गई है। पूरे बहुमत में, जो कल्पना नहीं की जा सकती थी। तो मेरे जहन में यह है कि एक तो लक्ष्य इनका स्पष्ट रहे। लक्ष्य है भारत की जो कंट्रोल या कमांड इकोनॉमी है उसको मार्केट इकोनॉमी में बदलना, ये लक्ष्य है। हिंदू राष्ट्र जो है एक अलग तरह का वो है जो एक लोगों को दे रखा। दूसरा क्या है, इसमें प्रचार के जो अत्याधुनिक साधन हैं, उसके अंदर साम्राज्यवादी मदद, बिना साम्राज्यवादी मदद के जो है ये इस स्थिति तक नहीं पहुंच सकते थे। तीसरा कारण जो मुझे लगता है, 2008 में जो सीपीएम ने कांग्रेस से समर्थन वापस का जो ऐतिहासिक ब्लंडर किया है, मैं समझता हूं ये ब्लंडर जो है बीजेपी को बढ़ाने में एक बहुत बड़ा रोल है। चौथी बात यह है कि लेफ्ट जो है उसका डिजिटल पॉलिटिकल मार्केटिंग की समझ का अभाव, जिस समझ को जो है पिछड़ी सोच होने के बावजूद जो है बीजेपी ने इस्तेमाल किया है। पांचवी बात है कि मार्क्सवादियों की जितनी भी मार्क्सवादी पार्टियां हैं उसमें मार्क्सवाद का डॉगमा बन जाना और नौकरशाही प्रवृत्ति की बढ़ोतरी। चौथी चीज यह है कि जो एंटोनियो ग्राम्सी का जो सोचना है कल्चरल हेजेमनी वाला, तो कल्चरल हेजेमनी में वाम जो हैगा किसी भी जो चार चीजें बताई हैं उन्होंने, परिवार, शिक्षा, धर्म और मीडिया, तो वाम जो है इन चारों से आउट है। तो इसलिए जो, बल्कि सुभाष गताड़े जी ने एक बार जो है मैंने लेख में इनका पढ़ा भी था कि वाम ने क्यों नहीं स्कूल खोले, शिशु मंदिर, तो ये बात इनकी वाजिब सवाल था इनका। तो क्योंकि कल्चरल हेजेमनी जो है उसमें से वाम बिल्कुल गायब है। फ्री राशन का जो नैरेटिव है उसका विकल्प जो है प्रचार लोगों में जाना चाहिए था, ये एक बड़ी चीज मौजूद थी जो लेफ्ट ने इसकी तरफ नजर ही नहीं डाली। दूसरा जो है वाम का जो सांस्कृतिक मोर्चा है उसकी सबसे ज्यादा जो है कमी है। तो मुझे लगता है मेरे नजर में तो ये है, और बहुत से कारण हैं जिस पर मैं लिख रहा हूं, तो मेरे नजर में यही है। क्या जोया हसन साहब या बताएंगी कि ये मेरा सोचना जो है इसमें से कितना दुरुस्त है?
आपका सोचना बहुत दुरुस्त है, इतना दुरुस्त है कि इसमें और आगे कुछ कहना जो है मुश्किल है, क्योंकि आपने बहुत कॉम्प्रिहेंसिवली बहुत सी बातें कही। उनमें से ज़्यादातर मेरे ख्याल में ज़्यादातर बातों से हम और मेरे ख्याल में यहाँ जितने ज़्यादातर लोग मौजूद हैं वो आपसे एग्री करेंगे। आपने बिल्कुल सही फरमाया। और आपने जो हिस्टोरिकल ब्लंडर का जिक्र किया, लेफ्ट के जो हिस्टोरिकल ब्लंडर्स 2 या 3 उन्होंने किए हैं, उसमें से यकीनी जो यूपीएस उन्होंने सपोर्ट विड्रॉ की और जिस इशू पे विड्रॉ की कि वो इशू की कोई सिग्निफिकेंस ही ना रही, ना उसकी पॉलिटिकल सिग्निफिकेंस थी। वो 2009 इलेक्शन में तो उसका कोई इंडो यूएस न्यूक्लियर डील, ये कोई इलेक्शन इशू का बनने का सवाल ही नहीं था। तो वो तो एक हिस्टोरिक ब्लंडर था। ये पहले ज्योति बासु को प्राइम मिनिस्टर ना बनने दिया, वो एक हिस्टोरिक ब्लंडर। और फिर दूसरा हिस्टोरिक ब्लंडर 2008 में जो इन्होंने सपोर्ट विड्रॉ की। तो ये तो आप सही कह रहे हैं कि ये सारी गलतियां। और अब आप इसी तरह से आप देख सकते हैं कांग्रेस कितनी गलती हैं जो हम और आप बाहर से बैठ के देख सकते हैं, जो ये कर रहे हैं गलतियां जो इन्होंने पंजाब में गलती की, या जो अब राजस्थान में शायद करने वाले हैं। अगर अशोक गहलोत को हटा के सचिन पायलट को बना देंगे तो फिर तो वही है डिजास्टर फोरटोल्ड, बिल्कुल वही होगा जो पंजाब में वहां पे कम से कम आप ये कह सकते थे कि अमरिंदर सिंह को एमएलए की सपोर्ट हासिल नहीं थी। मगर यहाँ तो आप ये भी नहीं कह सकते हैं राजस्थान में कि अशोक गहलोत को राजस्थान के कांग्रेस के एमएलए की सपोर्ट हासिल नहीं है। तो ये इसी तरह से जैसे आपने लेफ्ट की गलतियां बताई, हम लोग कितनी कांग्रेस की गलतियां पिछले कुछ सालों में देख सकते हैं। अपार्ट फ्रॉम द फैक्ट कि वो जो एक विजन, नैरेटिव, आइडियोलॉजिकल, वो सब तो इश्यूज नहीं है, मगर टैक्टिकल लेवल पे मतलब एक तो होता है आइडियोलॉजिकल लेवल, दूसरा स्ट्रेटेजिक और टैक्टिकल लेवल पे भी इतनी गलतियां हैं कि अब क्या कह सकते हैं।
एक सवाल मैं पूछना चाहता हूँ।
नरेश जी प्लीज एक मिनट, उनको मैं एक कन्नन श्रीवास्तव जी को बुला रहा हूँ बस।
जी
कन्नन प्लीज raise your question.
I'm not sure that I have anything to say beyond what I've already written, because I'm full of admiration for Zoha ji's discussion, which because I think she's addressed this important paradox of why, when you've had such a dramatic delivery of welfare with rights, that has been obscured by so much competing. I mean, not even competing, there's no competition, because the dominant publicity is this mythology, which is curious because it doesn't matter that each subsequent myth is proved absurd. As I challenged an elderly South Indian Brahmin relative on one of those things that my community spends so much time circulating on the internet. And he said, "Oh, is that true? I was wrong." Okay, fine. So he had moved on. So it doesn't matter that those trillions of Sonia Gandhi's things, in fact, the speech of Prime Minister Modi is still up there on the net, and the sums are very clear. They are well over $1 trillion, as I recall, that he promised to bring back within less than 90 days. Of that, there is no sign, but it is forgotten. They've moved on. So they've retained the sort of dominant narrative, and obviously I have nothing new to say, because you and this other gentleman also referred to Gramscian hegemony, and they've had this for so long that virtually nothing has penetrated, even during the UPA years. And they've been so long building it that many election strategies, I think, are beating against that tide of publicity, which was there long before they came into office. And I think I mentioned Professor Zoha Hasan's thing, which struck me. Of course, I'm not saying that is it's just because I've read that, that's all, about the advice of Barabanki, in which that first meeting of the United Provinces Assembly was described. But then so much else has also been. It struck me, for example, that Rajagopalachari's campaign for Hindi beginning the 1920s in Madras presidency was so important in fixing the Congress and Brahmin interests and Hindutva. I mean, he was not Hindutva, but that is a sort of identification. So the Congress was identified as the Hindutva party. And that is why the social welfare and the social reform and caste mobilization of even the Justice Party, but then certainly the DMK, the Dravida Kazhagam, and then the Munnetra Kazhagam have really kept Hindutva out of the sphere there. And now the thing which is so important is something so curious. It is the excavations at Baigai, because they seem to show a continuity, incorrectly or correctly, for many South Indian non-Brahmins between Harappa as an earlier non-Indo-Aryan civilization and Sangam. And so this is a completely different cultural world from one in which everything is related to certain sacred places where you can conjure up an Ayodhya movement out of thin air. because this is not, the Ayodhya issue is not one, say, in the widely known in the 80s. So this is the great success of this of Hindutva ideology, and of course the present government and the people around it, and the fact that so many people must be on state payroll working toward this throughout the social media. I mean, I think everybody knows what I know, so I don't. I think I'm sure that you have more things to say about this.
Not really, because you've said it very eloquently. So I don't know if I have much more to say, but I think the point you made about Ayodhya and how suddenly that movement, just developed into this major movement and an instrument for mobilization. That is something which is really quite extraordinary. Although, of course, the Ayodhya movement, the Ayodhya issue had been simmering for more than 100 years, and certainly had been simmering since 1948 and the installation, the surreptitious installation of idols in the Babri Masjid. So it was a point of dispute. But yes, but the whole issue was kept at bay for so long is what is equally, if Ayodhya could become such a big issue is surprising, equally surprising that it was kept at bay for so long. So I think both ways it is amazing. But I do think that Ayodhya, unlike the gentleman who said earlier, I do think that Ayodhya movement changed Indian politics like no other movement has. In a way, I would say there are, you could say, three or four big movements that have changed the face of Indian politics. You could say the JP movement, the Ayodhya movement, and then of course Mandal, and the anti-corruption movement in 2012, led by the India Against Corruption of Arvind Kejriwal and Anna Hazare. I think these have been the four big movements that have changed Indian politics. And within these four, I would say that of these four grand movements, if I could use that term, clearly the Ayodhya movement has been the most significant with the most far-reaching impact. But again, its impact, as I think you very rightly just said, is confined to North India. But then North India is so significant in terms of numbers that that we can't say that it is only limited to North India. But we are talking of, sort of 60% of India, so to speak, when we are talking of North India, where it has had its greatest impact.
Alok Tandon
May I just
raised his hand. Alok ji, sorry, please.
May I just point out one more thing for you?
Please.
Thank you.
Alok ji, 1 minute ruk jayega. Please.
Okay.
Kannan, please. You want to add something?
That one small thing. Not just in Urdu, in terms of Urdu and Hindi, and the whole set of connections. And I note here that Vinod Mubai, who is the nephew of R.K. Hazari, for whom I worked, the economist for whom I worked early in my career, who used to always complain that he said, I cannot follow All India Radio because every year they introduce new words which don't exist in any language because they're all compound Sanskrit words. And he was an Urdu speaker and writer. All through every Indian language, there's actually been this purging of primarily Farsi Persian, but also Arabic words, vocabulary. So it's dramatically evident in the case of Marathi, which went through this great change in, at least, maybe I'm wrong, but it seemed that Savarkar initiated that change. And because you can see in Pula Deshpande's plays so conspicuously that personalities who speak an older Persianized Marathi, which I still see in, if you go to land records in Maharashtra. And it's in other languages like Telugu and others, Telugu very conspicuously now, but right through. And this is a movement which is carrying on, which is very important. People aren't talking about it. It's part of the same phenomenon. So it's not just about Hindi and the UP and so on. So I just was mentioning that and what the relevance of that might be in terms of cultural hegemony. Sort of like what happened with Hebrew, because nobody spoke Hebrew before. Till recently.
Alok, please.
Oh, thank you very much, Professor Zoha, for boldly accepting that economic issues could not make voters vote against BJP. And I think from there, we can take something, some insight into that why these cultural factors trump over economic issues. And then the question comes, should we not revisit the old Marxist dogma of treating culture as an epiphenomena of economic forces, number one. Number two is when you accept that RSS has worked for 100 years nearly to communalize the mind of North Indians, at least Hindi people, what can be the strategy, long-term strategy on the cultural front to counter that propaganda and machinery and the organization and the success of RSS? And third, I would like you to ask, when RSS is talking and BJP is also talking about, and the danger is 24 when there can be a declaration of Hindu Rashtra, can there be an alternative, an ideological alternative to Hindu or cultural nationalism, or we can only base on this social justice politics of SP and BSP, which is already discredited in your talk. Thank you.
Well, again, I think your point about economic issues not being important, clearly the economic issues were important, but it's just that it's not, so we can't say that materialism played no role, but it's just that this is a materialism which benefited the right, whereas we generally connect materialism with the left or welfare with the left, but clearly that is not the case. So I think so we can't say that economic issues weren't important at all. But the other point that you're making about the cultural factors, I really and what kind, and that the left has neglected cultural factors. Well, yes and no in a way. I mean, after all, if you look at the whole progressive writers movement, that was a cultural movement. And at one time, when the left was more influential than it is now, the cultural aspects were important. But yes, I mean, the overall understanding is driven by greater emphasis on economic issues. Now, the point about, this is the dilemma. Should one be focusing on livelihood issues? Because you know very well, or rather because we know very well that we can't get very far on the cultural issues. But if you neglect the cultural issues, then you give space to communal politics to flourish. So this is the big dilemma. And I have to confess, one is at one's wit's end to see what is the way out. But it has to be a combination of livelihood issues which must be given, which have to be given the greatest prominence. But at the same time, clearly, I wouldn't call it cultural issues, because you see, the minute we say cultural, then we do get into this whole domain of, because in India, culture is so often identified with religion, and therefore the cultural then takes you into the domain of religion, and I'm not sure, and that is a slippery ground. So therefore, yes, I mean, non-economic issues, if I could put it very crudely, are also important, but how that can be taken up is not something that I can, that I have been able to really come up with any satisfactory answer, except that I can see that both economic and non-economic issues have to be addressed. But, there's just so many.
Professor,
Thank you.
Yeah, Professor Zoya, I myself have a small question. It's a not immediate about the immediate future impact or the current politics. It's little related. It's little historical to understand the historical developments that led to the emergence of Hindu majoritarian politics now, as you have already beautifully explained. I was thinking the dilemmas, not only before the left, also the liberal secular leadership of the national movement, which started nation building and other things. There are definitely two important agendas before them. One is modernizing the economy in the form of decolonization, industrialization, building infrastructure, building modern institutions, etc. For them, there seems to be a lot of support and approval of the larger society at that time in the Nehruvian period. But the other agenda, modernizing the social cultural sphere, which seemed to be always faced problems, in the sense that if you remember this Hindi movement, there were elements within the Congress which want to impose Hindi or Hindu kind of ideology was there within the Congress in some sections, but outside Congress, opposing to Congress, for example, Lohiite forces, they were the ones who were criticizing Congress almost in a derogatory sense, calling them urban elite and Western, all those choicest words they used to call Nehru leadership and Nehru's vision. And so some kind of earlier version of this present regime, which uses Khan market, libtard, and all those, the present terminology now we are familiar with, but similar kind of versions are there in the earlier period when the Nehruvian legacy has a hegemony over people. So do we think, is there a connection within the society which is opposed to modernization in social cultural sphere from their own angles, which was opposing Congress, apart from the Hindu communal right, which was there from the very beginning. But even non-BJP forces were there even before Mandal politics emerged very specifically in the 80s. So those forces continued. And we also see that in emergency time, the same Lohiite and other people who were opposing Congress and also Bharatiya Janasangh, Hindu communal right, they working together. So they emerging, this Mandal and in the form of Mandal and Kamandal kind of dichotomy in the politics, they occupying the space, the mainstream politics, nudging away both the left and Congress and other liberal agendas. So how do we see this? And finally, Mandal is swallowed by the Kamandal. So how do we see this? It's only just Hindu communal right wing or other forces which are opposed to social cultural modernization? How do we understand that?
I think you're quite right that the entire blame cannot just be put at the door of the Hindu right. And the question that you're asking is that there are other forces. I mean, for example, I mean, if we look at the whole Hindi movement and the parties which were promoting parties or forces, groups and organizations that were promoting the Hindi movement have, in a sense, I mean, while one cannot fault the promotion of Hindi, of course, but at the same time, that has, in a way, contributed to the growth of the kind of politics that we see. But you see, the interesting, then the curious thing is that while the whole Hindi argument is supposed to be anti-elitist, and it is often said that I mean, populism has an anti-elite dimension, including right-wing populism, that we have in India has that anti-elite dimension, Latvians and so on and so forth, the Khan Market gang, and so on. But the point is that in North India, and that is the interesting thing, that in North India, can we really say that there was an English-speaking elite which was dominating politics, economy and society, which needed to be challenged and displaced? I don't think so, because for the past 40 to 50 years, the Hindi elite has been well ensconced. And yet, now, of course, you could argue that at the central level, there was this sort of English-speaking elite. But the point then is that why is it that the anti-elite argument has takers in North India, where it is hard to say that an indigenous or Hindi-speaking vernacular elite was not already well established, and it is that very Hindi elite which has been Hindi elite, which is often from the backward caste, Mandal, and so on. And so a combination of all of them, of all of this, has been in power. Has been in power in North India. So yes, I mean, it's the whole story is so complex and multidimensional that we are only sort of touching the surface of it, so to speak.
नरेश ने हाथ खड़ा किया, नरेश लखनऊ से नरेश है. नरेश, please unmute.
Ma'am, is there a relationship between socialism and democracy? If it is so, then what is the way? How the left of India seriously think about the relationship between socialism and democracy? Because this is a big dilemma in the left all over the world.
That was a dilemma until the collapse of Soviet Union. But I doubt if after the collapse of Soviet Union and all that we have now learned about Stalinism and so on and so forth, I don't think the relationship between socialism and democracy is problematic, because it's very clear that that democracy is essential. So I don't think. I mean, why do you say that that is a problem now, post Soviet Union, when there is clearly a general acceptance of the centrality of democracy and the absence of it in Soviet Union, contributing, among many other things, among many other reasons, for the collapse of the socialist state, which again is a complex story, but surely that was one aspect apropos your question.
Because Russian regime is not considered as a democratic socialism, we are socialist democracy. It is dictatorship of politics.
The Soviet regime or the Russian regime today?
Soviet Union.
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying, that after the collapse of Soviet Union, surely the relationship between socialism and democracy is accepted that you have to have both. But how that works itself out is the whole question, because then there is the question of the of the party and and its role. I mean, the Communist Party and its role. So in a way, some of the new left movements have addressed this issue, but then the new left movements haven't gotten very far when it comes to electoral politics. And democracy today is so dominated by electoral politics, which the left has not mastered.
Pradeep Singh wants to ask some question. Pradeep.
थैंक यू सुभाष। वैसे तो हो गया, मैं जस्ट ये पूछना चाहता था कि जो इलेक्टोरल डेमोक्रेसी है वो बेस्ड है सिटीजनशिप के राइट पर, 1 सिटीजन 1 वोट 1 राइट। लेकिन जब वो एक्चुअल प्रैक्टिस हो रही है सोसाइटी में, तो सोसाइटी डोमिनेट करती है या डिवाइड होती है कम्युनिटी बेसिस पे, वो रिलीजन्स हो, कास्ट हो या अदर कम्युनिटी आइडेंटिटीज। तो ये एक मतलब इसमें क्या हो कि जो वोट लेने जाते हैं तो सिटीजन के नाम पे कोई वोट नहीं मांगती है कोई भी पार्टी ज्यादातर, तो वो मोबिलाइज करती है रिलीजन के बेस पे करेगा, कोई कास्ट के बेस पे करेगा, कोई और कम्युनिटी जो आइडेंटिटी है वो ज्यादा डोमिनेटिंग बन जाती है उसके अंदर। तो वैसे में रास्ता क्या है जब कॉम्पिटिटिव पॉलिटिक्स आज इस मुकाम पर पहुंची है कि कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन कुछ कहता है, लेकिन जब एक्चुअल प्रैक्टिस होती है इलेक्टोरल पॉलिटिक्स या इलेक्टोरल कंपटीशन जब होता है, तो वो मोबिलाइजेशन का बेसिस जो है वो जो आइडेंटिटीज है वो बनती हैं। तो अगर आज कोई बीजेपी को, आप ये तो सही है कि बीजेपी को डिफीट होना चाहिए और उसके लिए कोई लेफ्ट टू सेंटर अलायंस हो देश के पैमाने पे, कोई ऐसी स्ट्रेटेजी बने तत्काल, लेकिन लॉन्ग टर्म में क्या रास्ता है? क्योंकि आज एक बीजेपी को डिफीट करोगे, कल को कोई दूसरी बीजेपी पैदा हो जाएगी, क्योंकि वो मोबिलाइजेशन का बेसिस सोसाइटी में है। तो उसके बारे में प्रोग्रेसिव फोर्सेस को किस ढंग से सोचना चाहिए? थैंक यू।
देखिए, जो आपने सवाल किया है तो बहुत से लोगों ने किया है अलग अलग तरीकों से, और अब इसका क्या इलाज है ये तो कहेंगे, तो मेरे ख्याल में हम लोगों को इसी सब बातचीत से मेरे ख्याल में इलाज इसका निकलेगा। मगर जो आपकी असली बात है वो बिल्कुल सही है कि एक आइडेंटिटी पॉलिटिक्स का यहाँ पे एक वो है, एक स्ट्रॉन्ग बेस है। तो मगर देखिए, आइडेंटिटी पॉलिटिक्स का एक स्ट्रॉन्ग बेस तो है, मगर उसका पॉलिटिकल मोबिलाइजेशन, उसका पॉलिटिकल कंस्ट्रक्शन वो एक दूसरी चीज है। तो ये कहना कि क्योंकि आइडेंटिटीज यहाँ पे उनकी एक अपनी अहमियत है तो ये पार्टी चली जाएगी तो कोई और नहीं, ऐसा तो नहीं है। मुझे नहीं लगता है कि, हमें तो नहीं लगता है कि सारी पार्टी आइडेंटिटीज को या कम्युनल आइडेंटिटी को इसी तरह से इस्तेमाल कर रहे हैं या एक्सप्लॉइट करेंगी जैसे कि राइट विंग पार्टी करती है। तो इशू तो सारा यही है ना कि जो पूरा आइडेंटिटीज का पॉलिटिकल कंस्ट्रक्शन हुआ है, ये कोई स्पॉन्टेनियस तो है नहीं। अब या जो ये पूरा कम्युनलाइजेशन हो रहा है खासतौर पे पिछले कुछ महीनों में या कुछ हफ्तों में, तो ये कोई स्पॉन्टेनियसली तो लोग निकल नहीं रहे हैं। इसके पीछे भी एक पॉलिटिकल ऑर्गेनाइजेशन है, पॉलिटिकल मोबिलाइजेशन है। तो वही इलेक्शंस में भी होता है कि ये कोई स्पॉन्टेनियस तो है नहीं कि बिल्कुल स्पॉन्टेनियसली लोग कल्चरली महसूस करते हैं कि भाई ये एक हिंदू पार्टी, हमें इनको वोट देना है। वो अपने को प्रमोट करते हैं, प्रोजेक्ट करते हैं कि हम इस तरह की पार्टी, हमें और बहुत से अलग अलग तरीक़ों से अपने को प्रमोट करते हैं और लोग उससे अट्रैक्ट होते हैं तो और उससे मुतासिर होते हैं और उस वजह से उनके साथ जाते हैं। तो ये तो मेरे ख्याल में कोई आइडेंटिटी में कोई स्पॉन्टेनिटी नहीं है। ये तो जब आइडेंटिटी का इस्तेमाल किया जाए और उसका पॉलिटिकल कंस्ट्रक्शन है और पॉलिटिकल मोबिलाइजेशन है तभी होता है। ये तो आप एक तरह से नेशनल आइडेंटिटी को भी कह सकते हैं कि वो भी कंस्ट्रक्टेड होती, पूरा बेनेडिक्ट एंडरसन का जो आर्ग्यूमेंट है वो तो यही है ना कि वो किस तरह से आइडेंटिटीज कंस्ट्रक्ट होती, और वही हम लोग देख रहे हैं पिछले कुछ सालों से.
Vinod Mubai from Santiago has joined the meeting. He's in the meeting since beginning. So please, Vinod.
Thank you very much, Subhash, and thank you, Zoha ji, for a very incisive discussion. I have a small question which is coming up in the mind for the last few weeks, which is that in the last 7 or 8 years, we have seen that private lynch mobs have played a very significant role in furthering communalism, communal violence, and the spirit of Hindutva as a kind of phenomenon extending over all of society. Now, the state seems to be entering a lynch mob character, as shown by events in Khargon in Madhya Pradesh, and especially Jahangirpuri, where the state violated all laws, even defied Supreme Court for a while, and so on. So when the state becomes, in fact, a private lynch mob, what does this portend for the future of this bulldozer politics in UP and in other places? Some writers, commentators have raised very alarming scenarios of genocide and so on, mass killings of minorities. What is your feeling about that? Thank you.
I think we are entering a dangerous phase. I don't know if I would say that the state is become a private lynch mob, but surely the state is either looking the other way or backing some of these organizations and groups that are engaged in hate politics, divisive politics, and so on and so forth. So yes, I mean, this is very dangerous, and this needs to be contained. This needs to be controlled, and it's been several days since these events have taken place, and no one from the ruling party or the government has spoken against it. I mean, okay, even if the Prime Minister and the Home Minister don't speak up, surely no one else has either. And if there is any speaking, it is more in defense of what is being done, defense in the sense of talking about victimhood and how, and the whole focus is on attack on religious processions. Can't Hindus celebrate their festivals? I mean, when were they not able to celebrate their festivals? But the whole idea of these processions, which have a long history, but as a number of people have very interestingly pointed out that these Ram Navami processions in the past were not known to lead to violence. There may be others, there may have been some occasions when they have, but not necessarily. But now this is all being done is deliberately provocative, and the whole idea is to provoke a reaction. And once once you abuse people and you go and stand in front of places of worship and start abusing and so on, there will be some reaction. And if there is a reaction, then that reaction then becomes a justification for violence and so on. So I think there are lots of issues. One is, of course, all of this, but I think the role of the state and the role of the media and the judiciary. And we've seen this in the case of recent incidents that both have, Supreme Court in the end did did stop the demolition in Jahangirpuri, and has taken a serious view of the fact that the demolition did not stop for 2 hours, even after the Supreme Court had pronounced its position on this. So I think, but at the same time, I mean, see, it has taken so many petitions before the Supreme Court on this issue for the Supreme Court, and because it was happening in the capital, in Delhi. But similar things have happened in other states, and one would have expected the court to take suo motu notice of some of these issues, which it hasn't. So in a way, now the question really is for the Supreme Court when it pronounces its decisions 2 weeks from now, is that the issue is not simply that its ruling was violated, but I think the whole issue of demolition and the manner in which this demolition was being done without due process and without that, I think, is really the key issue. So yes, I think your point about, I mean, that we are at a very dangerous moment because most institutions stand compromised, stand undermined, and even and occasionally the courts are taking, well, at least the Supreme Court is occasionally taking the right position, but not always. I mean, and frankly, for me, until and unless the Supreme Court takes up the issue of electoral bonds, we cannot, I mean, the danger to our democracy is really coming from money power. And the danger to our democracy is coming from the fact that one party is pocketing 2/3 or maybe even 3/4 of electoral bonds. That is the issue. And why is it that the Supreme Court, 5 years after the electoral bonds were introduced, has not addressed this issue? And every time there's an election, a new tranche of electoral bonds is allowed to be opened. So this is really a key issue, which has unleveled the playing field. And until and unless the electoral bonds issue is addressed, and the whole issue of money power, and the nexus between money power and media, I think these are issues that really are central. And of course, the issue of institutions, which have been undermined. All of this is endangering democracy and causing a backslide, causing the backsliding of democracy.
Thank you.
Bhargav, Bhargav, please.
Yeah, thank you, Subhash. There are certain analysis and views while understanding the meaning of the verdict in UP especially. I'm just posing in a question form the points that are hidden in those analyses. There are 2 points. One is the communal agenda is very clear and it is very open and very simple to understand. But within that communal political agenda, there seem to be 2 hidden messages by the Sangh Parivar BJP to UP people. One is addressing their basic needs, some material benefits, which previous governments failed in addressing those basic necessities, delivering them. That is one aspect. So there is a material element in that communal agenda. Another thing is addressing the lawlessness in their own communal way, bringing back a strong state, bringing the law and order issue. So the large majority of Hindus who also love BJP for their communal agenda also like it for the kind of their strong action against lawlessness, maybe selective, maybe on Muslims and maybe on Yadav criminal elements, but nonetheless a law and order dimension is also there, a security dimension is also there. Can we really seriously take these two elements which helped them bringing success despite their miserable failure in many fronts?
Well, we address these issues, and I thought in my presentation, these were the two key issues. One is the law and order issue, and you're quite right. The welfare issue is important. Now, whether, and you're also right that, but I'm not sure whether basic needs are being addressed. It's one thing to provide people with certain with, let's say, toilets or electricity connections or gas cylinders on a one-time basis. But those are not, we are not even sure if those are the basic needs of people. Is that the basic need of people, or is education, health, employment, which is more difficult, which requires greater investment, which is difficult to monitor in terms of its progress? Is that more important? I think those are basic needs in my view, and not just gas cylinders and one time, which you just give one gas cylinder and you're not sure whether the person will ever be able to buy gas cylinders again, and the very modest cash transfers. Now, I wouldn't call these basic needs, but yes, there is, these have been provided, and people have been made to recognize that these are being provided by the government. And once the government provides, the government expects that people who benefit from this will vote for the party that provides them. So yes, in that sense, this is very important. What was your second?
Security.
Law and order. Yeah, of course, security is an issue, and you're quite right in saying, in pointing out that perhaps law and order was a problem. But I'm not sure whether the issue is really so much law and order, but as many people have pointed out, the control of thanas by local politicians belonging to the ruling party, which was in power before the BJP. So that Thana control by the local politician, that has been certainly shaken by this government. So when people say that law and order has been established, what they mean is that they can now go directly to the Thana and kind of bypass that kind of local control of thanas. Now that is significant. I mean, we have to recognize that is a significant change, but I don't know enough. I've only read about it in reports during the election campaign, that this is the change that has come about. And perhaps only an authoritarian government such as exists in UP could have done this. So, and also the third point that you're making is important, that implicit in this is the support for a strong man. And that strong man, in this case, is the chief minister and of course the prime minister as well.
We are moving to the conclusion of this meeting. I would request Comrade Ravi. If Ravi wants to make some comments, please.
Yeah, thank you, Subhash, and thank you again, Zoya ji, for so patiently answering all the questions. I am sure that there is great need for continued conversation and discussion and brainstorming. We at NSI asking too large a question, too large certainly beyond our capacity. But maybe it is a difficult question. Our emphasis is on the issues that lie underneath the social soil. So we kind of, at the risk of sounding at times pessimistic or at times too culturalist, we are asking, why is the playing field tilted against progressive forces? And we feel that question is not being addressed as directly by the left forces, by progressive forces, and if I may say so, even by progressive intellectuals, because we agree with all the descriptions that are given. We agree with the criticism that is made of various oppositional forces. But for example, I mean, I was listening to Rameshji after a long time, and if Rameshji exhorts all of us to go to the people, and we all gather courage to go to the people, assuming that we don't have that courage right now, as it comes from his statement, do we think that that is the only piece of puzzle missing? When we go to the people, we will succeed? I have a feeling, and we raise this question among ourselves often in NSI, that when Krishna was sleeping and when Arjuna and Duryodhana both went for support to him, as our, as our culture and tradition is, we don't go for right and wrong. We try to be on both the sides. He gave himself to Arjuna and he gave his army to Duryodhana. He supported both the sides. Of course, he decimated one side by his manipulations. But if we go to Janata Janardhan, will Janata Janardhan give something to us too? I mean, we raise that question to ourselves, So Janata Janardhan has moved ahead of Bhagwan Krishna, now it is much more decidedly on one side, and it is not simple a matter of going to people or not being anglicized and being vernacular. All the vernacular progressive forces, where are they and how are they fighting? They are more likely to be absorbed into the Sangh Parivar bandwagon,
Exactly.
So there is no point calling somebody Rahul Baba and ridiculing his being anglicized or his being not able to speak Hindi the way Hindi land speaks. I think he is very clearly ideologically committed to fight against RSS. And RSS has made a pappu out of him. We should not contribute to, oh, come on. We should not contribute to that kind of discourse, ridiculing. We need a very clearly articulated, very bold and courageous, secular, democratic, socialist, progressive politics to be stated. If people don't buy it immediately, so be it. But if you want to become a B team in order to attract popular support, then you can at best become AAP, and even AAP, the B team cannot really challenge the A team. That soft Hindutva and that kind of imitating A team is no strategy at all. And if at all it is a strategy, it is a strategy to keep the progressive forces, the right thinking forces, correctly thinking forces, pro-people forces out of the playing field. So this is the question we are asking. How do we go beyond describing what BJP has done and what opposition has not done? How do we go beyond describing that all institutions are being corrupted and being undone because they somehow get the army of educated people to man those institutions, who then do the undoing of those institutions from inside? That has been a long-term goal of RSS, and now they are in a position to do that. So what about the educated people? Why are they flocking to the Hindu majoritarian ideology and Hindu majoritarian politics? So it is easy to say that go to the people and people are not communalized. Of course, people are never communalized, but people, you cannot take people for granted. I mean, 90% or 95% of people supported Hitler, and it took a whole disaster of defeat, a disaster of Second World War defeat for Germany to come to senses, for German people to come to senses. So let us not say the obvious things about going to people and taking people, that people are not communalized. The playing field is tilted. People are involved in that. Cultural mind is made a certain way, and that the cultural mind, the way it is made a certain way, is helping the RSS I recognize their, decades old hard work, but that doesn't mean that our decades old hard work will pay equally as their decade old hard work has paid. And that is why we should admire what happened in the Nehru years. What a difficult question he had in front of him. The same society, the same religious society, the same society which has made the now tilting of the playing field obvious against us. And yet he could achieve what he could achieve. We as leftists criticized him at that time, and we as leftists now call that Nehruvian ideology is obsolete ideology. I think we on left, we have to do a lot of soul searching and go beyond populism and try to find out what is the reason that not only left has been marginalized, but left of center, mainstream, what we call bourgeois political stream also has been marginalized. So that is the question we are making central question of all our conversations at NSI. And we are, that is where Professor Zoha and others help us to try to go beyond description and beyond apportioning blame. What is to be done when the playing field, there is something to be done to the playing field itself. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well said.
Yeah. So I think with these words,
सबसे बड़ा काम सुभाष जी ये है कि घर में बैठे रहो, बड़े क्रांतिकारी हो। जनता तो जाहिल है, हम ज्ञानी आदमी हैं, जनता के साथ मत जाओ, हम घर में बैठे क्रांति कर देंगे। जी स्टूपिड नॉनसेंस।
अरे रमेश जी, आप जनता के साथ हैं, हम भी आपके पीछे पीछे चलेंगे, लेकिन किसके कहने से हम जनता के पास नहीं जा रहे हैं, ये बहस का मुद्दा नहीं है रमेश जी। यहाँ आकर जनता जनता करने से समस्या का हल नहीं निकलेगा। समझना पड़ेगा, समझना पड़ेगा, समझना पड़ेगा। हम घर में बैठ जाएंगे, लेकिन हम तो 130 करोड़ में एक है ना। आप
मोमबत्ती जलाने से काम नहीं चलने वाला है। बहुत हो गया भाई, ऑन द फील्ड, सड़क पे आइए भाई, लड़ना पड़ेगा भैया। बिना लड़े घर बैठे बंद कर देंगे आप, मजाक कर रहे हैं बिल्कुल।
नहीं, फील्ड के साथ साथ वैचारिक सवाल भी बहुत महत्वपूर्ण है, जिसको साथ लिए बिना नहीं हो सकता।
बिल्कुल ठीक। तो मेरे ख्याल से इन शब्दों के साथ ही हम लोग we should conclude this meeting, interesting meeting. I once again thank Professor Zoha Hasan for sparing her time and enlightening this discussion. We'll again call her again so that we can learn from again. So I thank all the participants also for this meeting, who joined this meeting and participated in the discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया. Thank you. Namaskar.